He would pay.
It's okay. There we go. There it is. Okay. You doing all right, Matt?
Yeah, just busy with the kids and busy with life and doctor's appointments and blah 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 and sleepovers and just feel like I'm behind even though I don't have a job or do much else with my life. Actually, that's not true.
Oh,
I mean you get it.
yeah.
I just feel like things are intense right now and I wish I don't know. There's never enough money. But share
Well, Donald Trump will improve your life situation.
really won't. So
Back.
apologies in advance because
Go ahead and retry. Yeah. There you go.
um where I'm going to suggest that we do is so I want to read through um some of this. I'm not going to read through all of it because he really rambles on for just a second or two or three or five. Um and I get the feeling that every time you go through this, he restates the dialectic. Okay. So if you read in um, so you read like 1653, and he says the determinations of the opposition are the general determinations of the notion, for it is the notion which has been sundered, but the filling of these determinations is the idea. One extreme is the unity of the notion in reality, which is the idea as the immediate unity that in earlier stage appeared as objectivity. So he's mapping out, right, what this looks like in the syllogism, but also in general, right? And it's almost like he repeats himself
Yeah.
every single time, and he could almost write a single chapter on the process and then just all the separate chapters on the notions. That's one way he could have organized it. But I feel like he really wants to drive home the transition properly between stages so that you don't get lost. But the
I,
thing is that sometimes when he says notion, I wonder if he just means the notion or if he means the notion as in life, as a category, right? Because sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other, depending on the context. I'm pretty sure in the German, it would be a little more obvious which one it is, but because A.V. Miller used the same word, you really have to search for it in the context. Makes me wonder what other translations of this look like. I just have this feeling that all of the subsequent translations would look back to that one, as a place to start. It's what I would do, but I think it would also be really, it'd be really confusing, followed by even more confusing, right? Kind of
yeah.
sucks that way. So I'm going to start off with 1659 because this is just really the end of the first part or the immediate part. So the living individual. Thus, it is in the first place universality, the pure internal vibration of vitality or sensibility. The notion of universality, as we've found it above, is simple immediacy, which, however, is this only by being within itself absolute negativity. This notion of absolute difference with its negativity, dissolved in simplicity and self-similar, is brought to view in sensibility. It is inwardness, not as abstract simplicity, but as an infinitely determinate uh, receptivity, which in its determinateness does not become something manifold and external, but is simply reflected into itself. Determinateness. Wow. Yeah. Wow. I'm partially lost. Determinateness is presented in this universality as simple principle. The individual external determinateness, a so-called impression, returns from its external and manifold determination into the simplicity of self-feeling. Sensibility may therefore be regarded as the determinate being of the inward existent soul, since it receives all externality into itself while reducing it to the perfect simplicity of self-similar universality. So I think he's talking about the taking in
Like your
of,
multiple internal states.
yeah.
And so that's kind of the body recognizing different pieces of itself, but it's singularities of a single universal, the living person.
Ah, okay. Universality. See, he's talking about the syllogism here.
You know how I got that? That picturing Hegel book.
Yeah, I'm glad you're reading that. I haven't gotten a chance to look at it. In fact, I'm kind of still afraid to because I'm still trying to get this down just by the descriptions. Um,
It's to me, it got to the point the descriptions just started flying out of my head, so I needed
yeah,
something to ground it.
exactly. Kyle, can you read the second determination of the notion?
The second determination of the notion is particularity. The moment of the positive difference, the opening up of the negativity that is locked up in simple self-feeling, or is an ideal, not yet a real determinateness in it, that is, irritability. On account of the abstraction of its negativity, feeling is an urge. It determines itself. The self-determination of the living being is its judgment or its self-limitation, whereby it relates itself to the external as a presupposed objectivity and is in reciprocal activity with it. Now, as a particular living being, it is on one side a species alongside other species of living beings. The formal reflection of this indifferent diversity into itself is the formal genus in its systematization. But the individual reflection is this, that the particularity, the negativity of its determinateness, as a direction outwards, is the self-related negativity of the notion.
Thank you. Okay. So yeah. And Jim, could you read 1661?
According to this third determination, the living being is an individual. The precise determination of its reflection into itself is such that it, in irritability, the living being is its own externality to itself, to the objectivity which it possesses immediately as its means and instrument, and which is externally determinable. This reflection into itself sublates this immediacy on the one side as a theoretical reflection, that is, insofar as the negativity is present, on the other side as real reflection, in that the unity of the notion posits itself in its external objectivity as negative unity. This is the unity of the notion.
Uh,
This is reproduction. The
yeah.
first two moments, sensibility and irritability, are abstract determinations. In reproduction, life is concrete and is vitality. In it, as in its truth, life for the first time has also feeling and the power of resistance. Reproduction is the negativity as simple moment of sensibility, and irritability is only a living power of resistance, so that the relationship in to the external is reproduction, and individual identity with self. Each of the individual moments is essentially the totality of all. Their difference constitutes the ideal form determinateness, which is posited in reproduction as concrete totality of the whole. This whole is therefore, on the one hand, opposed as a third, namely as a real totality, to the former determinate totalities, while on the other hand, it is their implicit, essential nature, and at the same time, that in which they are embraced as moments, and in which they have their subject and their subsistence.
Okay. So you notice in this paragraph about the individual, he talks an awful lot about the whole, which defines the individual and how the whole is characterized by all the individualities and particularities within it. It's continues to be a circle, you know. It's not just the hard and fast definition of the individual by itself. You can see the dialectic in this paragraph sort of going round and round. It's really kind of cool. The last section is he just says with reproduction as the moment of individuality, the living being posits itself as an actual individuality, a self-related being for self, but at the same time, it is a real relation outwards, the reflection of particularity or irritability towards another, towards the objective world. The process of life, which is enclosed within the individual, passes over into a relation to the presupposed objectivity as such, in consequence of the fact that when the individual posits itself as a subjective totality, the moment of its determinateness as a relation to externality becomes a totality as well. So here he's saying that the living individual, as it relates to the outside world, begins to uh, sort of posits its relation to life in general is what he's saying, and this being the totality in which it finds itself, you know, in interacting with its environment, the living object, you know, whatever that is. And he keeps it really kind of locked down here as any living individual, you know, from a frog to us, right? This is sort of what it looks like in the dialectic of the life process going on. And speaking of which, we go right into this, and I'm sorry if I'm moving kind of fast here. I kind of want to run through these. So how much is there to talk about? Probably a lot, but I'm just gonna start if that's okay. Um, uh, uh, Kyle, go ahead and read 1663.
The living individual, in shaping itself inwardly, tenses itself against its original act of presupposition and opposes itself as an absolute subject to the presupposed objective world. A subject is its own end, the notion, which has its means and subjective reality in the objectivity that is subjugated to it. As such, it is constituted as the idea in and for itself, and as a being that is essentially self-subsistent. In face of what the presupposed external world has the value only of something negative and lacking self-substance. It is self-feeling in the living being has this certainty of the intrinsic nullity of the otherness confronting it. Its urge is the need to sublate the otherness and to give itself the truth of this certainty. The individual is, as subject, in the first instance, no more than a notion of the idea of life, a subjective inward process in which it draws on its own resources, and the immediate objectivity which it posits conformably to its notion as a natural means is mediated by the process that relates itself to the completely posited externality, to the objective world totality standing indifferently alongside it. So it's now externalized. Instead of it being relating to itself, it's relating to the objective world. Yeah.
Yeah. Jim, go ahead with 1664. Do you want me to increase the
No,
size? Okay, give me just a second.
it's old people that have trouble seeing now.
No. It's no. I'm Right there with you. All right.
Okay. This process begins with need, that is, with a moment that is twofold. First, the living being determines itself. In so doing, posits itself as denied and thereby relates itself to an other, to it, to the individual objectivity, but secondly, no, to the indifferent objectivity, but secondly, it is equally not lost in this loss of itself, but maintains itself therein and remains the identity of this self-similar notion. Thus, it is the urge to posit this other world as its own, as similar to itself, to sublate it and to objectify itself. By doing this, its self-determination has the form of objective externality, and as it is at the same time identical with itself, it is absolute contradiction. The immediate shape is the idea in its simple notion, objectivity that is conformable to the notion as such. It is good by nature. But since its negative moment realizes itself as an objective particularity, that is, since each of the essential moments of its unity is realized as a separate totality, the notion is sundered into an absolute disparity with itself. And since all the same, it is absolute identity in this disharmony, the living being is for itself this disharmony and has the feeling of this contradiction, which is pain. Pain is therefore the prerogative of living natures because they are the existent notion. They are an actuality of infinite power, such that they are within themselves the negativity of themselves. That is, their negativity is for them, and that they maintain themselves in their otherness. It is said the contradiction is unthinkable, but the fact is that in the pain of a living being, it is even an actual existence.
There's a new book out from HM talking about subsumption and how Hegel's his notion of subsumption is less than serviceable than Marx's. And he points to Marx's use of it in Capital. And subsumption in Capital is basically the taking over that Capital does of older ways of life and subsuming those older ways of life, people, material, processes, families, homes, towns, the world, under its sway, right? But I read this and I can see how he's describing the life process and the way that the individual adapts itself to life in general, but also how life in general adapts itself to each individual. And I feel like his notion of subsumption is perfectly. I mean that word isn't in here, but it's the same thing as saying, um, you know, um, thus, it is the urge to posit this other world as its own, as similar to itself, to sublate it and to objectify itself. These processes sound exactly the same as some of the process of capital as a historical process, right? Within the discussion of the historical mode of production. So yeah, this is why I continue to read Capital because, or well, continue to read both really, but I continue to read Hegel this closely, and am just like blown away by how he's able to get across these concepts. And one of the things that gives me a lot of joy is that you know, um, unlike Kant, who only located um, uh, the contradictions around four sets of antinomies. Hegel's one of Hegel's big insights is it wasn't just those eight categories; it was all of the categories that display this movement, this this characteristic of the dialectic. You know what I mean? Like you cannot take a category and not have it display this, and each category that displays it in a way that's particular to it, right? So you couldn't just abstract the dialectic from any old category and get you a good set of laws. I mean, Engels tried, but it's like Hegel says, they're like husks, right? The words and even the abstracted process ends up being more of a husk in description than the active movement of the absolute idea. So,
Like the caterpillar leaving behind its chrysalis and becomes a butterfly, but we're holding on to the chrysalis.
yeah, exactly. Or the cicada.
Yeah.
Oh man. Okay, I'm going to keep reading because this just it's making all my brain cells fire. This diremption of the living being within itself is feeling. The diremption being taken up in the simple universality of the notion into sensibility. From pain begins the need and the urge that constitute the transition by which the individual, which is explicitly the negation of itself, becomes also explicitly its own identity, an identity that exists only as the negation of the former negation. The identity that is in the urge, as such, is the subjective certainty of itself, in accordance with which it relates itself to its external, indifferently existing world as to an appearance, to an intrinsically notionless and unessential actuality. This actuality has to await the subject, which is the immanent end, because it receives the notion into itself. The indifference of the objective world to the determinateness and consequently to the end constitutes its external capability of being comfortable to the conformable to the subject. Whatever other specifications it may possess, its mechanical determinability, the absence of the freedom of the immanent notion, constitutes its impotence to maintain itself against the living being. Insofar as the object confronts the living being in the first instance as an indifferent externality, which was the first paragraph, right? Where it enters into relationship with the living being, it does not act on it as cause, but excites it. Because the living being is an urge, externality cannot approach or enter it except insofar as it is in its own very nature already in the living being. Therefore, the action on the subject consists merely in the latter finding the externality presented to it conformable. This externality may not be conformable to the subject's totality, but at least it must correspond to a particular side of it. And this possibility resides simply in the fact that the subject, in its external relationship, is a particular. There's a lot going on here, and I didn't get all of it. What do you think, Kyle?
Let me
Jim?
go back there.
Hmm?
Freedom of immanent notion.
Well, I mean, if we think of this as the second stop in the triad, he mentions appearance. He mentions, how it
That's
hasn't received the notion into itself yet, right?
yeah.
And so, it's relating to the outside world. It's relating to, the life process, but it's also not fully realizing that objectivity and subjectivity are the same thing, right? So this is a living being who is relating, but not one with nature yet, I guess you could say.
In fact, I think in a way we could even see eating in a way as the considering this too, because it's taking the outside and it becomes the inside.
Yeah. And like he mentions feeling, and we've already talked about how feeling and intuition are, and pictorial thinking are sort of, I wouldn't say they're inferior, but they're early versions of taking in the objective world around the subject without realizing that you're the subject yet. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, 1666. Jim?
Now the subject as specifically related in its need to the externality, and so itself an externality or instrument uses violence on the object. Its particular character, its finitude in general falls into the more specific manifestation of this relationship. The external element in this is the process of objectivity in general, mechanism, and chemism. But this process is immediately broken off and the externality transformed into internality.
Eating.
External,
Yeah. Sorry.
the external purposiveness that is produced at first by the activity of the subject in the indifferent object is sublated by reason of the fact that the object relative to the notion is not a substance. Therefore, the notion cannot become merely the object's external form, but must posit itself as the essence and immanent pervading determination in conformity with the notion's original identity.
So it's not that you become the other becomes you and always was, I guess you could say. Like you don't just, yeah. Okay.
You are what you eat.
Something like that, yeah.
I
All right,
mean, you have a
1667.
notion in biology, the environment,
Yeah.
shapes the individual organisms, but the organisms are always reshaped in the environment. And of course, the other organisms are a part of the environment that each individual organism is facing. So, ecology is a good, in ecology, you basically have what Hegel was talking about here.
Yeah. And I mean it reflects in the very first sentence too, here. With the seizure of the object, therefore the mechanical process passes over into the inner process by which the individual appropriates the object in such a manner as to deprive it of its peculiar nature, convert it into a means for itself, and give it its own subjectivity to it for substance. This assimilation accordingly coincides with the individual's process of reproduction considered above: eating, sleeping, all the rest of it. In this process, the individual is in the first instance draws upon itself in making its own objectivity its object. The mechanical and chemical conflict of its members with external things is an objective moment of itself. The mechanical and chemical side of the process is the beginning of the dissolution of the living being. Since life is the truth of these processes, and therefore, as a living being, is the concrete existence of this truth and the power dominating these processes, it takes them within its embrace, pervades them as their universality, and their product is completely determined by it. Whoa. Product, commodity, etc. This conversion of them into the living individuality constitutes the return of this latter into itself, so that production, which as such would be transition into another, becomes reproduction, in which the living being posits itself as self-identical for itself. Now, first thing that jumps out at me in this is that he could be talking about Marx's capital process, whereby when the labor and the raw materials become a commodity, it becomes part of the larger body of capital itself in its processes. It's produced, then it's distributed through the circuits of capital, and then it's consumed, and the worker goes back to work, or some of it is used to recapitalize. It's very interesting. All right, 1668. Cal.
The immediate idea is also the immediate, not the explicit identity of the notion and reality. Through the objective process, the living being gives itself feeling of self, for in that process it posits itself as what it is in and for itself, namely as a self-identity in the negative unity of the negative in its otherness, which is posited as indifferent to it. And its coming together of the individual and its objectivity that at first was presupposed as indifferent to it, the individual, which on one side has constituted itself an actual unity, has nonetheless sublated its particularity and raised itself into universality. Its particularity consisted in the direction by which life posited as its species, the individual life, and objectivity were external to it. Through the external life process is thus posited itself as real universal life, that is, as genus. Yep. Just
And that caps off the life process itself.
like that's like the catness of a cat, the humanness of the human come
Yeah.
out.
Ooh. Okay, going straight into genus. Is that me? Yeah. Okay. The living individual, at first disengaged from the universal notion of life, is a presupposition that is not as yet authenticated by the living individual itself. Through its process with the simultaneously presupposed world, it has posited itself on its own account as the negative unity of its otherness as the foundation of itself. As such, it is the actuality of the idea. I'm going to read two of these. In such a manner that now the individual brings itself forth out of actuality, whereas before it proceeded only from the notion, and that its genesis was, which was an act of presupposing, now becomes its production. So we've come to the other side of it. But the further determination that it has attained by this ablation of the opposition is that of being the genus as identity of itself with its previously indifferent otherness. This idea of the individual, since it is this essential identity, is essentially the particularization of itself. This its diremption in accordance with the totality from which it proceeds. Yeah, from which it proceeds. That's cool. Is the duplication of the individual, a presupposing of an objectivity that is identical with it, and a relationship of the living being to itself as to another living being. Okay, so yeah. So this is where a genus of whatever you want to talk about, right, starts to come out in this process. Okay, Jim, 1671 and 72, please.
Okay. This universal is the third stage, the truth of life insofar as this is still confined within its sphere. The sphere is the self-related process of the individual, where externality is its immanent moment. Secondly, this externality is itself as a living totality, and the objectivity that for the individual is for its own self, an objectivity in which not as sublated, but as persisting. The individual has the certainty of itself. Now, because the relationship of the genus is the identity, self-feeling in which is at the same time another subsistent individual, it is contradiction. Thus, the living being is again an urge. Now, the genus is indeed the consummation of the idea of life, but at first it is still within the sphere of immediacy. This universality is therefore actual in an individual shape, the notion whose reality has the form of immediate objectivity. Consequently, though the individual is indeed in itself genus, is not explicitly or for itself the genus, what is for it is yet only another living individual. The notion distinguished from itself has for object with which it is identical, not itself as notion, but a notion that as a living being has the same time external objectivity for it, form that is therefore immediately reciprocal.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Here he's really drilling down into uh it sounds almost historical the way he puts it, right? This sphere is the self-related process of the individual where externality is its immanent moment, right? It's what pervades it. Secondly, this external is itself as a living totality and objectivity that for the individual is its own self and objectivity in which the individual has the certainty of itself, right? So the individual has the certainty of itself by confronting itself with the other objects in that totality that is the genus, right? Yeah. But at this stage, it's only another self subsistent individual, like he says here. And so it's a contradiction. There's something in another, but they're not yet identified as within a unity that's a whole. Or is it? All right. Can you guys hold on for 2 seconds? I will be.
That works top what we're doing because I think it's selectable. Is that coming through, Jim, at all? Me? Or are you still saying Matt's?
This is the doctrinal concept.
Okay. Yeah, so you see the graph, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's about where we're at, where you can ignore this section because that's supposed to be the inner and outer still. That's looping back between itself. And so the immediate force of relation between life and the object is still not established. U as genus in itself, or the natural mating kind of life that is, and P's is, yeah, that's the particulars of the genus male and female. That's only, yeah. Again, you can see why I'm having issues with prep of some of this. This has so much of Hegel's commentary condensed into it. Yeah. Categories such they are not alive. Instead, you must divide living individuals that are so categorized. Natural mating kind of house cat, for instance, divides into male and female cats, not into categories of maleness and femaleness. And then this is, oh yeah, now we're starting to get into mating where we have the universal through the particular, it creates a new singular, which is the germ of a new particular. Yeah. Let's see here. All right. Cool. That was also a good test because I wanted to see how that works later.
Okay, where were we? Sorry about that.
No worries. By the way, I did test something that seems to work.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so I can share right quick. So there's
You want me to stop sharing?
well, that's funny. Pick my ghost out. Yeah, I'll let it drop. Okay. Um, I was trying to see if I could show a little graph of what maybe it looks like, but I think if I'm not going to risk a crash again.
Oh, you're fine. I'm stopping sharing. Try to share your thing.
Oh no, it was working. We could do both at once. I just got to open the book again. Video. Oh, it does have a history. I think we're still like right here because the immediate for itself relation between life and the object is still unestablished. So we just have the universal natural mating kind of life that is particular is a set of sexually particularized individuals or singularities of the genus. Um, and
Do
then
you,
yeah,
do you find that this conforms to the text pretty well?
it seems to, at least what I've read of this part. I was actually going to try from the start, but it does bring stuff up like the disjunctive syllogism, which is how it splits into particulars. It's two.
Yeah.
So she brings that stuff up back a lot in redescribing these, which is
Yeah.
why some of these goes on forever. According to digestive syllogism, universal divides an exhaustive set of mutual categories. Blah, blah.
Yes.
That judgment says U is P universal is a medium necessarily particular in the groups to which it divides. Yeah, see, it's pretty exhaustive. So try not to.
No, but that's good too because
Yeah,
like um
for this.
the character of the syllogism and the judgment as it pertains to the notion, especially the notion past those elements. I mean, it should be applied to every one of them.
Which is to say that it must be the same kind of thing genus is. So each universe divides into particulars, which is the same kind of genus it is. As the stage is a purpose, and it goes through. It's just I'm not trying to overload too much for this, but I'm just trying to
Yeah.
show what all she does. Because U is life, it sunders or divides. So yeah, we have already seen one. The genus of life must divide into other lives, and the categories rights of male and female are not alive. Male and female house cats are the living beings that define the genus house cat as a mating kind.
Yes.
But at this point, it's male and female is not important as a particular
Right.
yet.
Right, exactly. And indeed, those appear in either nature or spirit. And at this level, it's more of a general process of life, of the genus itself.
Yeah,
And remember, genus by itself does not exist. Like you're not going to find a genus, right? That this is a moment of the living process, right? That's sublated far higher in nature than this. But the logic um, traces genus down to its categorical state as part of the idea, and so on and so forth. You know, it's like talking about um, it's talking about becoming without talking about time or space. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
how can you talk about becoming without time or space being even a factor yet logically? Well, you can, as Hegel shows.
It's just yeah, it's like the time-like concept, but it's like it's not external. It's
Exactly.
intrinsic. So
Yeah.
kind of a pre-time. And of course, this is the example of the universe. This is mating, basically, where you have the particular produces a singular, which is the germ, which represents the universal, aka, the baby's undifferentiated example of the genus that hasn't yet,
Yeah.
differentiated itself, and eventually, because particular is
All
singular.
right, shit, man. You've
Yeah.
sold me. I've got to get this book. This looks fascinating. I could spend weeks looking at this thing, and
Yeah.
that is so fucking cool.
And then, of course, the singular particularizes back to itself, and now we're starting to have a relationship back out. And then, yeah,
Yeah.
it's works because language is itself the most bare bones pictorial aspect that we can talk about, because we get to the point we can just read it without. So if you can do the same thing graphically, you can get the language out without getting stuck in the pictorial.
Oh, this is cool. Hey, listen to this. Hegel's logic, at the top. Hegel's logic cannot rest with an endless or spurious infinite process. The
Yeah.
job of the logic, in part, is to define its terms, but an endless back and forth process leaves both terms in the process undefined. Logic can achieve the goal of defining its terms then only if there is some way to stop the back and forth process. And we saw this with we saw this at the very beginning with being in nothing, constantly oscillating. In the last stage, becoming, and again, this is reproduction. I love it. The process of reproduction was defined as a process in which sexually particularized individuals produce a germ or baby. That definition led to a spuriously infinite process of going back and forth between P and S. In this stage, the endless back and forth process. This is fascinating. Okay, first of all, I think Hoolgate would take. I think Hoolgate would take uh, exception to jumping the gun into nature at this stage, right? Because that's what she's doing. She's
Yeah.
like using it. She's putting. Um, she's jumping ahead in order to fill out what the logical categories are, whereas Hoolgate would be like, you can't do that. I mean, you can,
It's like you said,
but you
sometimes
kind of can't, you know?
you have to have the pictorial, concrete examples to see the abstract
Yeah,
underneath.
yeah,
That-
and I think that's what she's doing, and I appreciate that's what she's doing. As long as you know that in actually moving along the imminent process, you can't actually, like Hegel wouldn't have been able to do this and keep the imminent character of the logic itself wholly imminent. And so, as a process of pictorial representation, I think it works. I think it works well. Okay, all right, let's get back to uh, um,
Hegel proper.
yeah. Sorry, I don't mean to be a. I'm not trying to be a dick.
No, no,
Sorry.
no, no. It's we were trying to get back to.
Sleeping.
Like I said, I was just trying to show little bits and parts of it. It's like, yep.
No.
Well, let me.
Yeah. Are you sharing again or
Fine.
okay?
You're gonna be here this weekend. Really, really, really. Yeah, and just have a nice dinner. I don't. Even if I'm not able to hang out with Kinsey again until Sunday, I'll be like, "Hey, do you want to get breakfast?" It's like, "Do you want to hang out?"
Did you guys have a good time?
It's not working. Yeah, we hung out yesterday. Yes.
Or yes, that's
Did you start your new job today? No, I'm on vacation.
No.
You already said that. I'm sorry. All week? Yeah, all week. I'm off all.
You're gonna have to give us the tour.
Sour
new one.
Patch.
I actually am gonna be working in Whitehall.
Sour
Yeah, I can
Patch
work
Kids.
Huh?
Well, no, that's what I meant.
No, honey, that's for tomorrow. Sorry.
School tomorrow.
School tomorrow.
Mommy's going to work tomorrow.
Yeah, mommy's going to work tomorrow and she has an early meeting at 7 and I'm tired and I'm grumpy. And that's nobody's fault, but
Not tomorrow.
Sorry, you all heard the whole thing. Okay, and so do YouTube. Where were we?
Getting back to genus
Hi, buddy.
on your end.
Goodbye, my
Mommy's
besties.
tired.
Yeah.
I have a name.
Yeah. Besties. Goodbye, besties.
Hawaii.
Okay. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Yep.
It's Hawaii.
Okay.
How would I know this? That's the best part.
Okay.
Going to bed. I that water, you need more.
Okay. I don't know who was next, so I'll just read the next two. The identity with the other individual, the individual's universality, is thus as yet only internal or subjective. It therefore has the longing to posit this and to realize itself as universal. But this urge of the genus can realize itself only by sublating the single individualities which are still particular relatively to one another. In that first instance, insofar as it is these latter which in themselves universal satisfy the tension of their longing and dissolve themselves into the universality of their genus, their realized and identity is the negative unity of the genus that is reflected into itself out of its diremption. You notice how much of this chapter Lenin didn't, uh, underline in his notes, and only toward the end here, does he give this one line a quick highlight? I find that interesting, considering how much of the sort of the dialectic process of the external to the internal there is, Okay, 1674. It is thus the individuality of life itself, generated no longer from its notion, but from the actual idea. In the first instance, it is itself only notion that has yet to objectify itself, but it is the actual notion, the germ of a living individual. The germ is visible evidence to ordinary perception of what the notion is, and it demonstrates that the subjective notion has external actuality. For the germ of the living being is the complete concretion of individuality in which all its diverse aspects, properties, and articulated differences are contained in their entire determinateness, and the initially immaterial subjective totality is undeveloped, simple, and non-sensuous. The germ is thus the entire living being in the inner form of the notion. Okay, so Kyle, Jim, what's Hegel getting at here with these two? A little bit, especially, the realized end identity is the negative unity of the genus that is reflected into itself out of its diremption. Disremption? It's got to be diremption. Hang on.
Says
Shit.
disruption.
Oh,
Yeah. Oh, I know what it says. I'm just wondering if this is a typo because, like, if I turn to the genus and I find this, yeah, it's diremption in the original. Someone added an S.
okay.
Yeah, but deliberate or was that a mistake?
Yeah, that's a mistake. Okay. All right.
Diremption is noun means a sharp division into two parts.
Yes. Yeah. And you're right, Jim. That's what he's been narrating all along. Really, is that sharp break into two parts. You have the genus and you have the individual. Go ahead, Kyle.
I was Googling, searching the word disruption just for the heck of it, and it says, quote, the word disruption springs into existence in 1874, the date William Wallace translated the logic of Hegel.
Great.
Notably.
Yeah. Well, it's
It is
funny
an
because
invented word.
AV Miller's came later,
Yeah.
and he corrects the uh, yeah. That's awesome, Kyle. I I love when stuff like that happens. It goes in the history books whether you want it to or not. All warts and all, you know. Okay, last two paragraphs, and actually that we're doing great. Kyle, go ahead with 1675.
The reflection of the genus into itself is from this side the means whereby it obtains actuality. The moment of negative unity and individuality being thereby deposited in it. The propagation of the living species. The idea which as life is still in the form of immediacy, thus falls back into actuality, and thus its reflection is only repetition in the infinite progress, in which it does not emerge from the finitude of its immediacy, spurious infinity. But this return into its first notion has also the higher side, that the idea has not merely run through the mediation of its processes within its immediacy, but by this very act has sublated its immediacy and therefore raised itself to a higher form of its
Form of
existence.
existence. Yeah, exactly as your book
Hmm.
with the diagram talked about. That is so cool. And notice again, this is the life process, right? And how it, yeah, stands by itself outside of, well, any animal, any genus, any species, right? This is an essentiality of a much later and external form of the idea, right? And which has a logic of its own logic of objectivity and subjectivity, right? Over and above can be defined by itself, and that's exactly how Hegel puts it here, without reference to any particular species, any individual person. It's a universality of logic itself. Well, of the idea itself is probably how Hegel would have put that. Okay, rounding it out, Jim, 1676, if you please.
That is to say, the process of the genus in which the single individuals sublate in one another their indifferent immediate existence and this negative unity expire has further for the other side of its product the realized genus, which has posited itself identical with the notion. In the genus process, the separated individualities of individual life perish. The negative identity in which the genus returns into itself, while it is on the one hand the process of generating individuality, is on the other hand the sublating of it, and is thus the genus coming together with itself. The universality of the idea in process of becoming for itself. In copulation, the immediacy of the living individuality perishes. The death of this life is the procession of spirit. The idea which is as genus is implicit is now explicit in that it has sublated its particularity which constituted the living species and has thereby given itself a reality that is itself simple universality. As such, it is the idea that relates itself to itself as idea. The universal that has universality for its determinateness and existence, the idea of cognition.
Okay. I'm going to repeat exactly what you said at the very end there, real quick, so that we can end on it real nicely. The idea, which as genus is implicit, is now explicit, in that it has sublated its particularity, which constituted the living species, and has thereby given itself a reality that is itself simple universality. As such, it is the idea that relates itself to itself as idea, the universal that has universality for its determinateness and existence, the idea of cognition. And remember, only humans have cognition. So this last section talks about how nature in general raises itself to a higher state of life process, that of cognition, which is considered separately, but which is a higher I don't know. It's like you said, it's the pinnacle of the life process, which is just damn fascinating. Okay, we had chapter 1 life. So yeah, so the idea of cognition, and the idea of the true analytic. Oh yeah, synthetic cognition. Oh yeah. Sorry, I'm just kind of going through here, seeing what there is. Okay. So yeah, comments.
Well,
Pretty cool, huh?
and then I guess it is again funny to just think about this in a way of like the logic of the universe necessit just by its own course necessitates life at some point of its existence,
Yeah.
independent of what life that would explicitly be.
Well, um, there is there is a I think I think that there is an urge, I guess you could say, among us to look at these paragraphs on the process of life and try to turn reality into a life generating machine, right? But I also have to think that so obviously we have the logic of cognition coming, the transition to cognition coming at the end of life, right? And it seems to me that you cannot read this as a historical process in Hegel's hands and the logic, but the way that it's related by pictorial representation would make you think that that's where it's going historically. The problem with this, of course, is that if you turn Hegel's logic over into a historical mode, especially in these sections, it almost turns into like a prophecy generator. Like life was always going to generate cognition because that is what's logical, and that's not at all what Hegel's saying. Okay, he acknowledges that nature generates life, and life generated cognition, and cognition generated philosophy, but he's not saying that this was all inevitable. I don't think.
Yeah,
He's
it's
he's
like
saying that this is what happened, and here is how we are going to logically connect it together, because logically, life is prior to cognition. Because of course it is, even historically, right? But he's not talking in a historical mode here.
because I think we go back to like the conditions need to exist before something comes into
Yeah,
Yeah,
So
that's what I'm thinking. Like
so when
it's
you say that life grounds cognition, it's not the same thing as saying that life inevitably would have
right,
created cognition. Those are two different statements.
right. It's just in my mind is that the possibility for life being there is interesting.
That's what he means. You
Yeah,
remember early on in the logic, he would continually raise the subject about how, um, oh, how, what was the phrase, Kyle, Jim? He said, a journey through the logic is a retreat into the ground. That's what he's talking about. When you retreat into the ground, you're not actually projecting forward all of reality as it is from being. It's a retreat into the ground that is being, right?
yeah,
All of this stuff already exists, and we're trying to trace it back to its cell form, like the commodity, right? And so once we trace it back to that cell form, then we rewind the tape, turn it over, right? And play the tune logically from the ground, which is being, all the way through what is. Because it already is what it is, right? It
right,
already exists historically, right? We have the spirit, which is all of humanity. We have nature, which is all of objectivity around us, right? And it already exists historically. And it's played out for millions of years, et cetera, et cetera. But in order to trace trace it back, you've got to retreat into the ground. Holy shit. That's a breakthrough for me. Okay. I don't know about you, but I just had that eureka moment. Like that's what he meant. You retreat into the ground. You don't prophesy what life will turn into as in cognition. You ground cognition in life. You ground life in what's the one before it? Shit.
before life,
Yeah,
purpose,
what comes before life?
purpose. Subjective purpose through means creates its objective purpose. Uh, Hegel's works at the top. That's what I think you're looking for. And then, yeah,
Okay, so at this point we're in the idea, and the idea begins with life, but before that you have objectivity, which yeah, purpose. Yeah. This shit is brilliant. This guy was a fucking genius. And so this to me also throws light on how capital was conceived, because if you understand this process of unfolding the notion and you watch Marx unfold a capitalism that already exists in his world and wants to do so logically, he has to retreat into its ground, which is a finite ground. It's not an infinite ground of being. It's a finite ground of the commodity. And from that finite ground, you can unfold the circles, the pseudo circles of production, of distribution, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, okay, yeah, it makes sense now. Sorry, I just had a fangirl moment for Hegel there.
yeah, it's kind of how I felt when I was going through how the full detail that maybe he was saying that everything went through with the syllogism. It's like, oh my God, would never have thought about it that way.
Yeah.
And he had like decades most of the time to sit and focus on a lot of this stuff.
Well, he was a high
As his
school
job.
teacher.
Yeah.
Well, for a little while anyway.
And his kind of part of his job, right? So
Well,
I-
yeah, he taught classes in logic. So I mean, by the time he got around to like writing down all this shit, I mean, it probably wasn't that hard because he's not just sitting there in some study doing nothing. He's like living life and being able to see all of these processes of like the immediate idea playing out in in people's heads and how that extreme compared to the infinite version of it kind of came together. I'm not even sure if what I said made sense, but I'm not even sure it made sense to me. I'm just sort of processing this, like trying it out. Like, okay,
I think German high schools in Hegel's day were very much elite institutions, so
yeah,
the level of instruction would be much higher than what you'd find at a contemporary high school.
yep. Which
You
is
know,
why if I'm still in this position during my kids' high school, I'll probably pull them out and say, okay, we're not doing that shit. We're gonna sit here and read some real philosophy and literature.
nowadays you'd have to go to university to study at the level that high school students in Hegel's day would have been studying at.
Yeah, yeah. No, I completely agree. And to be honest, it makes me really, really angry.
That's the concession of school as the, tool for, uh, you know, making a worker.
Yes, the ruling class is trying to make a worker who doesn't care about big ideas. They don't want you to be woke. They want you to be a cog. They don't want you to have cognition. They want you to be a cog.
Yeah,
Wow.
George
Okay.
Carlin used to say that they want they want you to know enough to be able to operate the machines, but not so knowledgeable you question the system.
Exactly. Yeah. Makes me very angry. Makes me want to be more involved in my kids' education because right now um, I'm not as much as I should be. And there are only so many hours in the day too, which really sucks. Given what you said, Jim, it really is true. You know, if you have the money to send your kids to college, then you have the money to turn them into well-rounded individuals. If you don't,
All the, there's a whole hierarchy of universities. The elite ones still try to make you into a well-rounded individual, but most of the colleges, universities that are available to like working class or lower middle class people, they're basically there. It's just job training, really.
yeah.
So
And with that, well, we're ending on a downer.
yeah.
We just went through the life process, and then we're reflecting on how
Well,
narrow a life process the bourgeoisie wants our kids to have as workers.
I mean, it can't be one-sided.
Exactly.
In this country, U.S., I mean, we had the great expansion of higher education after the Second World War, which was done originally was done because policymakers at the time were afraid that once the war ended, we'd go right back into the Great Depression again.
Yeah.
So the idea was you'd send all the returning GIs to college, keep them out of the job market for a few years. But what happened was the economy actually went into a boom, and it turned out employers needed more white collar workers. So it worked out well for them at the time.
Yeah.
Then when we get into the '60s, it we get what from the ruling class was very the downside of that trend, which was social unrest, and
Yeah.
it was college students leading the way. in the 60s and in the 70s.
Yeah, exactly. There's a section in the Encyclopedia Logic where um, Hegel talks about how philosophy back in the ancient world led to unrest and
Yeah.
questioning of the state, and then they put Socrates to death.
Yeah.
They put Copernicus to death. Every time society gets too aware of itself, the ruling class dunks the head of collective humanity underwater. And it's been happening for how many years? 6,000 at least, if not
Yeah.
more, right? And this is why we have, and to all those watching, this is why us commies um, demand struggle, because otherwise, you know, life, culture, it'll all be turned into this gray, you know, hell on earth. And on that note, comrades, I thank you. Next is going to be the idea of cognition, and we need to get into this is a long section, and I'm not sure if I want to sit and read through this all. I'm kind of thinking like Alex here, how much of this do I really want to like read out? Um, let's talk about it on the yeah, let's talk about it on the DM over this week. But if you don't hear anything from me, just start reading through chapter 2, the idea of cognition, and let's try to gauge how much of this is really worth spending our time on YouTube, and in Zoom.
I did already read the opening section and
Okay.
briefings, they call it, and that's pretty much him at least talking about the abstract I versus the concrete I he wants to talk about.
Yeah.
Going through Fichte and Kant and those conceptions of how the abstract I just doesn't really work.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, Fichte. Yeah, that's another thing for the audience. Hegel criticizes Fichte because Fichte tries to create an abstract I from the concrete I that actually exists, and it falls into too many contradictions in and of itself. First of all, because there's no such thing as the abstract I in general, and so it's a synthetic. Um, it's a posited. What would he even call it in terms of his system? It's a posited ought, right? That doesn't actually exist. And so it doesn't even contain within itself what could be an I that is, as a set of data. What's the word, Kyle? Uh, it's not even
It's an empty I know that.
no, it's not that. It's what's the opposite of necessity? Co- um,
Possibility or
well, I mean, yeah,
no.
it is part of possibility, but it's like there's freedom and necessity, and then there's necessity and contingency.
Yeah.
Like the abstract I isn't even a contingency in either thought or being, right? It's a completely synthetic notion that's sort of like it wouldn't be a consistent part of the logic even if you tried, I think. Anyway, I got to put him to bed real quick, so I'm going to leave it here, comrades. But like I said, we'll talk about how much we're going to talk about, but just read chapter 2 to the end as best you can, and we'll talk about what to cover for next time. Because I feel like there's a lot here. Like remember how Kant, remember how Hegel talked about Kant saying that you have to investigate cognition before you cognize, right? And he said, no, no, no. Investigating cognition is an act of cognition itself, right? Like investigating how your brain works depends on thinking already, right? It's like learning to swim without getting in the water. That's Kant. Whereas Hegel says learning how to swim, you have to get into the water, right? Learning about eating, you have to eat. You can't just read a book about eating before you start eating, or you'd starve to death, right? Before you made it to the College of Gastronomy. You know what I mean? And he says it's the same thing. And I just have this feeling that in this chapter, he's really going to get into how you conceptualize cognition by thinking. So that there's that to look forward to. Comrades, you have a very nice night.
Daddy.
See you next week. Or wait, are we doing next week?
I was going to say we want to.
Is the 16th all right with everybody? It's okay with me.
I
Yeah.
am. Okay.
Okay, great.
Daddy.
All right. Have a good night.
Night.
Right.